Great, welcome back. We are now going to look at the second part of strategy analysis. Let me share my screen with you. All right, so let's now have a look at the second part of strategy analysis. So we can look here at the value spectrum again, and I will just briefly remind you that we are on the potential side of the value spectrum. So we are assessing the current state and the future state and planning how we would approach a change in terms of a change strategy. So strategy analysis very much sits on this end, whereas the actual end is all about in production, we've done all the work and the systems are running. So let's now take the next task called define future state and have a look at the elements that this is all part of. So with the purpose, define future state is to determine the set of necessary conditions to meet the business need. Now, if we have a bit of a deeper look here, a purposeful change must include a definition of success. So business analysts work to ensure that the future state of the enterprise is well defined, that it is achievable with the resources available, and that the key stakeholders have a shared consensus vision of what the outcome is going to be. So the future state describes the new, any removed, and modified components of the enterprise. So let's look at what makes up the future state. What are all the different elements that we as business analysts need to consider? So business goals and objectives, scope of solution space, constraints, organizational structure and culture, technology and infrastructure, capabilities and processes, policies, business architecture, internal assets, identifying the assumptions, and potential value. So let's see what is all of this about. All right, so the first one is business goals and objectives. All right, so let's have a look at what is the difference between a goal and an objective. So a goal is being defined as a longer-term, ongoing, and qualitative statement of a state or condition that the organization is seeking to establish and maintain. As a goal is then analyzed and converted into more descriptive, granular, and specific objectives, and it is also linked to measures, it becomes possible to objectively assess if the objective has been achieved. So let's look at a quick example. So a goal statement might be something like it increase the number of high revenue customers, whereas the objective can be increase the number of high revenue customers in the 30 to 45 age bracket by 30% within the next 6 months. So suddenly your goal has now been broken down into a very specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bounded statement or objective. All right, so let's look at the next element, which is referred to as scope of solution space. So this defines which kinds of options will be considered when investigating possible solutions, including changes to the organizational structure or culture, capabilities and processes, technology and infrastructure, policies, products or services, or even creating or changing relationships with organizations currently outside the scope of the extended enterprise. So just take note here that the solution scope must align to business objectives, and you may need to compare options of solutions in terms of value, time, and opportunity cost to the organization. So think of the solution space or the scope of the solution space as all of these different elements being considered and potentially forming part of this scope. Okay, so now let's look at element 3, the constraints. So constraints describe aspects of the current state and the planned future state that may not be changed. Now, you will be familiar with some of these constraints, like, for example, budget constraints or time constraints that we often hear about when we work on initiatives. But there could also be technology constraints or infrastructure constraints that is preventing us from being able to change those aspects, and we need to consider that when we define a future state. Similarly, policy or skills or compliance-related constraints, as well as other types of constraints, could be introduced that affects how we can define the future state. All right, so now let's have a look at element 4, which is about the organizational structure and culture. So here the real question we are trying to answer is there a need to change the formal or informal working relationships or culture? And this is a consideration that you should make at the time you now understand the current state. So when you start working towards the future state, this is a valid question to ask. Element 5 is around capabilities and processes. And here the question becomes, what new or change processes and capabilities will be needed to support the future state? So this is quite an important question, and you may need to ask this question in many different ways over a period of time, because this can potentially become a big part of the definition of the future state. Then you get to this element around technology and infrastructure. The question is, should we change any of the technologies or infrastructure in order to support the planned future state? And what might that look like? So is it potentially time to upgrade? Policies can also change. So good to consider all of the policies that could potentially be impacted by the change that's being planned or the future state. So have a good look at what those are and make sure that they will remain valid. And if they can't remain valid, perhaps help by identifying how they may need to change. Element 8 is about the business architecture. So here the point we're making is that the elements of the future state must support one another and all contribute to meet the business goals and objectives. So it should also fit into the future state vision of the organization. Element 9 is around internal assets. So the assessment of needed resources to support the planned future state is done when performing a feasibility analysis on possible solution approaches for the change strategy. So this is all about, like we said in some of our previous videos around internal assets, this is about understanding what's the future state we're hoping to get to and what are the different considerations or options we're considering for how we could potentially change to get to that future state. And now we're saying, all right, if we look at those different solution approaches, what internal assets will we need to enable those particular approaches? And remember, internal assets is things like your financial resources, or we also mentioned things like reputation and brand, but it could be any tangible or intangible asset or resource that the organization has. If we then look at element 10, identify assumptions. So most strategies are predicated on a set of assumptions that will determine whether or not the strategy can succeed, particularly when operating in an highly uncertain environment. So change strategies in uncertain environments can be structured in order to test these assumptions as early as possible to support the redirection or termination of the initiative. So every initiative that you ever undertake will likely have some assumptions that was made. So the sooner you can test whether those assumptions were correct, the better, because you could save a lot of time and effort and cost effectively if you could find out whether those assumptions were accurate or not. If they were not accurate, you need to quickly work out what's the impact and determine whether the change could go forward. And then element 11, which is called 12, is the potential value. So the potential value of the future state is the net benefit of the solution after operating costs are accounted for. So it is a normal thing to consider that if you make a change, you would expect some value to come from that. But it's important also to note that it may be possible that there will be no additional value, or the value of the organization could actually deteriorate. So it's important to also realize that the potential value of any future state or future solution may in fact not be there. There may be a negative value, or there may be no value increase to the organization as a whole. And this could happen when we've implemented something purely to meet a regulatory requirement or be compliant in some way, or simply to stay ahead in terms of our competition. So the organization as a whole may not have an increased value, but at least they're still in business. So it's important for you to understand these differences and that you can see how ideally we would always like to say we can increase value, but that it's not always going to be the case. Okay, so over to you. We've had a good discussion now about the future state. So raise any questions that you might have about this topic in the Facebook group, and share any examples that you perhaps have had some experience of that would help others. Anything else that you think we might want to include in our research and learnings in preparation for the exam, please add that as well. So thanks again. It's wonderful to be able to share some of this information and experiences with you, and I hope you've learned something new today. Thank you.